You can feel it the moment you step outside. The tension, the pressure, the quiet sense that something in Western Canada is shifting beneath our feet. Prices rising, futures shrinking, voices growing sharper in town halls and kitchen tables. And for the first time in a generation, people are whispering questions once unthinkable. Questions about identity, about belonging, about what happens when a country stops listening to its own people. Before we go deeper, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because what comes next affects every Canadian. You feel it before you see it, before the headlines, before the numbers, before the debates about budgets and borders and who deserves what. It starts in the small moments, the quiet, unsettling ones. A mother standing under the fluorescent lights of a grocery store, staring at a total she can't afford. A father at the kitchen table, calculating a mortgage payment that keeps rising no matter how many hours he works. A young couple sitting in silence, wondering if their future has already slipped out of reach. This isn't drama, this is daily life in Western Canada. A pressure that settles into your bones, tightening with every bill, every policy announcement, every hint that the people making decisions live worlds away from the people surviving them. And as the pressure grows, so does the distance between citizens and leaders, between expectations and reality, between the West and the rest of the country. It didn't happen overnight. It moved slowly, like a glacier cracking from within. Quiet at first, then deafening. Inflation rose, interest rates surged, housing costs towered over wages, grocery bills swallowed paychecks whole. And for millions of people from Alberta to Saskatchewan to Manitoba to BC, the question became unavoidable. Is the system still built for us? It's the same question Canadians asked during the oil price collapse in the 1980s. During the National Energy Program, during every moment when the country felt like it was splitting, not by borders, but by priorities. History isn't repeating, it's resurfacing. You hear it in the tone of town halls, in the exhaustion of farmers, in the frustration of energy workers, in the quiet resignation of families who no longer believe the future they were promised still exists. A sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the cracks in the Federation aren't forming, they're widening. People aren't talking about politics anymore. They're talking about survival, about dignity, about whether staying the course leads anywhere except further decline. And that's why this moment feels different, heavier, more fragile. Because this isn't just a cost of living crisis, it's a crisis of faith, in institutions, in leadership, in the very idea of what it means to belong to a nation that no longer feels like home. In the next chapters of this story, they won't be quiet. It begins with the small sacrifices, the skipped meals, the trimmed budgets, the vacations that quietly disappear from calendars because the numbers don't add up anymore. Western Canadians have always carried more than their share. Long winters, volatile markets, boom and bust cycles that built entire towns and then emptied them out. But this time, the struggle feels different, deeper, more personal, because this time, it's not just one sector hurting, it's everyone. Official data shows the cost of living rising faster than paychecks can keep up, inflation pushing groceries beyond reach, rent climbing at a pace never seen before, interest rates hammering down on families who did everything right, saved, planned, bought homes they could once afford. Every month, the mortgage grows heavier, like a stone tied to the future. Across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and BC, you hear the same stories. Young people working 2 jobs and still falling behind, families choosing between heating and groceries, seniors watching fixed incomes erode in real time. Even those with steady careers feel the ground shifting beneath them, as if the stability they once trusted is dissolving grain by grain. And while households fight to stay afloat, the divide between Canada's regions widens. People in the West talk openly about being unheard, not just underrepresented, but invisible. Decisions coming from far away, from offices thousands of kilometers east, where the consequences land on someone else's doorstep. policies built for a different economy, a different geography, a different reality. It's not anger that fills living rooms anymore. It's fatigue. You hear it when a farmer talks about rising diesel costs that turn a year's work into a loss, when a small business owner explains that interest rates have crushed expansion plans, when a young couple admits they've given up on owning a home in their own province. These aren't political arguments, they're survival confessions.
Recent reports indicate that household debt has climbed to historic levels, mortgage payments eating more than half of families' income, renters facing increases that feel like eviction notices written in slow motion, and with construction delays and shortages, supply can't keep up with demand, leaving more people competing for fewer homes. Everywhere you look, the pressure tightens. The price of milk, the cost of fuel, the shrinking value of a paycheck, the quiet realization that for the first time, the next generation may live poorer than the one before it. And when these frustrations build, people start asking questions, not extreme questions, honest ones. Why are we struggling this much? Who is this system actually helping? What happened to the promise of a better future? The frustration isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, relentless. It doesn't erupt, it seeps into bank accounts, into conversations, into every corner of a region that once believed hard work was enough to guarantee stability. Now, that belief is slipping away. There's a moment when frustration turns into something heavier, when emotion becomes evidence, when the numbers, the charts, the trends start telling a story people have felt for years but couldn't quantify. That moment is now, because the data coming out of Western Canada isn't just concerning, it's revealing. It shows a region pushing harder than ever, yet falling further behind. It shows households absorbing pressure that would have shattered past generations. It shows a quiet shift in the country's foundation, a misalignment between where the strength is produced and where the decisions are made. And once you see the numbers, you can't unsee them. Recent reports indicate that the average cost of housing across many Western regions has surged at rates that outpace wage growth by alarming margins. Homes that once required a steady income now demand a lifetime of sacrifice. Mortgage stress levels are rising, not slowly, but sharply, tightening around families like a vice. Rent has climbed with equal force, swallowing paychecks whole before other needs even enter the equation. According to national housing data, new construction is falling behind population needs at a pace that experts describe as unsustainable. Delays, shortages, and rising building costs have slowed the pipeline to a trickle. What should be relief becomes scarcity. What should be supply becomes competition. Migration patterns tell another story. People leaving expensive metropolitan areas in search of affordability only to find that the pressure has followed them. Interprovincial movement rising not for opportunity, but for survival. A quiet redistribution driven by economic squeeze, not ambition. And then there's the productivity gap, the widening divide between regions generating the country's energy, food, and building materials and those collecting the gains. Official data shows Western provinces continuing to shoulder an outsized share of national exports and resource output, yet residents feel the least rewarded for it. The math doesn't feel fair anymore. The distribution doesn't feel balanced. The country no longer feels aligned with itself. You can see the tension in debt levels rising month after month, in savings accounts shrinking like melting ice, in the rising number of Canadians needing support for basic needs, in the job market where growth slows even as life becomes more expensive. It is a slow-motion unraveling, and the data reads like warning lights flashing on the dashboard of a country speeding toward uncertainty. And that's when conversations start shifting from emotion to analysis. People begin comparing their region not to other provinces, but to entire economic systems. They look south not out of ideology, but out of pragmatism, to compare wages, costs, market access, and economic stability. not to imagine a different flag, but to understand why their own system feels increasingly misaligned with their reality. This isn't rebellion, it's reflection. A region trying to understand why its output, its sacrifices, and its contributions no longer translate into security. The data doesn't shout, it whispers, quietly, persistently, relentlessly. And now its message is unmistakable. Something fundamental has shifted, not just in the economy, but in the relationship between the West and the country it helped build. It never starts with a collapse, it starts with a tremor, a small shift, a single number moving in the wrong direction, then another, and another, until one day the ground beneath you isn't solid anymore, it's cracking.
That's how this crisis unfolded. Not in an instant, but in a chain reaction. A slow, grinding sequence of decisions, shocks, and pressures that built on each other until ordinary people were left carrying the weight of an entire system on their backs. It began with inflation, a surge that hit like a wave. First groceries, then fuel, then utilities. Every essential cost rising at a pace that stunned even economists. Official data shows prices climbing faster than incomes for months on end, stripping purchasing power from families who were already budgeting down to the dollar. Then came the interest rates. A policy meant to cool the economy instead froze households in place. Mortgages doubled. Loans became landmines. Lines of credit turned toxic overnight. People who had planned carefully, saved diligently, bought modestly, suddenly found themselves staring at monthly payments that no longer matched their reality. It was supposed to stabilize the system. Instead, it destabilized lives. But the chain didn't stop there. As borrowing costs rose, construction slowed, projects stalled, supplies dwindled, labor shortages stretched timelines thin. What should have been the solution, more homes, more rental units, more supply, fell behind just as population growth surged. Recent reports indicate the gap between housing demand and housing availability widening at one of the fastest rates in the country's history. More pressure built, competition for rentals, bidding wars for homes, crowded markets, tight inventories, and a sense of scarcity settling over entire cities. Then the slowdown hit. Businesses held back investment, hiring cooled, hours were cut, salaries stagnated. Even those still employed began feeling the tremors, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the tightening. Household debt rose, savings fell, and families who once felt secure now talk about cutting essentials, not luxuries. But the chain reaction didn't only play out in bank accounts, it played out in identity, in confidence, in trust. Western Canadians watched their contributions, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, supply chains grow more valuable while their own stability grew more fragile. They watched decisions impacting their livelihoods made far away, often without the urgency their daily lives demanded. They watched the gap widen between policy and reality, between promise and experience. And slowly, the mood shifted. Not because of a single event, but because of the accumulation of hundreds. A grocery bill too high, a mortgage too heavy, a rent increase too sharp, a policy too disconnected, a paycheck too small. The chain reaction wasn't caused by one spark, it was caused by the friction of years. And now, the outcome is visible everywhere. Strained households, stretched communities, a shrinking middle class, a rising sense that the system isn't bending, it's breaking. This isn't a momentary crisis, it's the consequences of a chain reaction still unfolding. A slow collapse felt one family, one bill, 1 month at a time. And the next link in the chain hasn't hit yet. Identity doesn't break all at once, it frays, quietly, thread by thread, year by year, until a community looks in the mirror and no longer recognizes the country staring back at it.
That's what's happening across Western Canada. It's not just the bills or the budgets or the policies, it's the feeling, the subtle, sinking feeling that the West is carrying more than it's getting back, that its voice is softened in the national conversation, that its priorities are treated as regional complaints instead of national realities.
You hear it in the tone of people who never cared for politics, farmers who only wanted a fair season, energy workers who just wanted to do their jobs, small-town families who believed hard work would always be enough. Now they're asking questions they never imagined asking. When did we stop mattering? Why doesn't anyone listen? Are we still part of the same country, or just part of its resource list? It's not rebellion, it's resignation. A slow, emotional withdrawal from institutions that once felt like home. Across rural backroads and prairie highways, you can sense a shift in the air, a kind of weary defiance, not the loud kind, not the protest sign kind, the quiet kind you hear in coffee shops at 6 a.m., where old farmers whisper that something has changed, the kind you hear in workshops and loading bays, where workers talk about future plans in hypotheticals because certainty no longer exists. People aren't plotting anything. They're preparing themselves emotionally for whatever comes next. Recent polling shows a rise in dissatisfaction, not just with policies, but with the direction of the country itself. A growing belief that Western priorities are misunderstood, minimized, or simply ignored. A sense that decisions are being made by people who will never feel the consequences of those decisions. And that's where identity begins to strain. Because the West has always been defined by contribution, feeding the nation, powering the nation, building the nation. But now, many feel like contributors without influence, providers without partnership, a region essential to the country, but not essential in its decision-making. You can feel the fracture in conversations about opportunity. People comparing Western conditions to those across the border, not because they want another identity, but because they're trying to understand why their own feels increasingly unstable. It's not loyalty in question, it's belonging. This isn't a separatist wave, it's a crisis of recognition. A region waiting, hoping to be heard in a country that feels further away each year. And when people start to question their place, their value, their future inside a system they once trusted, the strain becomes more than political. It becomes personal. A quiet tension settles over the West, a feeling that the identity it once held with pride is being tested, pulled, thinned, held together only by habit in history. And history shows us something else, too. Once identity begins to fracture, the nation around it often follows. There's a moment in every crisis when people begin to ask questions they never would have dared whisper before, not because they want change, but because they no longer believe the path they're on leads anywhere but deeper into the storm. And in Western Canada, that question has taken on a new shape, a sharper edge, a tension thick enough to feel in the air. The American question. It doesn't appear in headlines or official speeches. It shows up in living rooms, in farmyards, in late-night conversations at gas stations and hockey arenas and break rooms where no cameras are watching. It starts quietly. How come they seem to have more stability? Why do their industries get approval faster? Why does their cost of living feel easier? Why do their markets align more naturally with ours? Not a desire to leave, a desire to understand why the system next door feels like it's functioning, while their own feels like it's stalling. Because when people compare themselves to the United States, it's not patriotism fading, it's security slipping, not identity lost, opportunity shrinking. Economic realities feed the question. Most of the West's energy exports already flow south. Trade routes run along lines drawn by geography, not politics. Market pricing mirrors American benchmarks more closely than national ones. Families depend on industries tied directly to U.S. demand. So when households struggle to afford their futures, they compare themselves to the ecosystem they're already linked to, not as a dream, as a calculation, and the question grows sharper. Recent reports indicate rising frustration with national decision-making because Western Canadians feel like observers instead of participants in choices that affect their survival. They watch their industries wait years for approvals the U.S. processes in months. They watch investments hesitate because policy predictability isn't guaranteed. They watch opportunities move elsewhere. And when people feel sidelined long enough, they start looking over the fence, not out of disloyalty, but out of desperation for stability. That's what the American question really is: a pressure meter, a warning signal, a symptom of something deeper than politics. It's the sound of a region wondering what life could look like under a system with different rules, not because they want that system, but because they want a future where they can breathe again. This isn't a movement, it isn't a plan, it isn't a roadmap to another country. It's a reflection of a deeper truth. People ask impossible questions when they see no possible solutions.
And that's what shakes the country. Not the idea itself, but the fact that ordinary people, once confident in their place, are now imagining alternatives they never would have considered in calmer times. The American question isn't about another flag. It's about the fear of losing everything that made the West strong. It's about searching for stability in a time when stability feels like a memory. It's about a region so pressured, so strained, so exhausted that even the unthinkable has become a discussion. And when the unthinkable becomes thinkable, a nation should start listening. No country breaks in an instant. It drifts, quietly, silently, one decision at a time, one disappointment at a time, until the gap between regions becomes too wide to ignore and too deep to bridge. That's where Canada stands now, at a crossroads disguised as a calm moment. A moment where the pressure hasn't erupted, but it's rising. A moment where the frustration hasn't exploded, but it's spreading. A moment where Western Canadians aren't demanding radical change, but they're no longer dismissing the idea either. What comes next isn't written in policy documents or economic forecasts. It's written in the choices people make when they feel unheard, in the futures families choose when their present becomes unsustainable, in the conversations whispered across kitchens and job sites and long, empty prairie highways. Because the truth is simple: if the pressure keeps building, the country will feel it. If affordability keeps collapsing, households will break before the system bends. If the divide keeps widening, unity becomes a slogan instead of a reality. And history has shown us what happens when nations ignore their warning signs. They don't fracture overnight. They fracture slowly, through declining trust, rising regional fatigue, and a sense that the future is slipping away faster than anyone can catch it. That's the danger now. Not separation, not rebellion, but the quiet unraveling of confidence, the belief that the country will protect the people who built it. Because once that belief fades, everything else begins to follow. Western Canada is asking a question, a hard one, a necessary one, a question the rest of the country can no longer afford to brush aside. What happens next depends on whether anyone is listening. And if you want this conversation, this truth to reach the people who need to hear it, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who's feeling the pressure, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of a story still unfolding. Because this isn't the end, it's the warning, the whisper before the break, the moment before the map changes, or the moment we finally pull it back from the edge. What do you think happens next? Tell me in the comments.